The exercise was called Operation Autumn Storm. Set in the fields of East Germany, it was a full-scale simulation of World War III. Soviet armor surging across the Fulda Gap, NATO responding with every asset in its arsenal. Hundreds of tanks, dozens of battalions. Close air support units from both sides represented on paper and radio. The Soviet observers stood with arms crossed as the simulated battle commenced. They expected an armored sweep, a validation of their doctrine. But what they witnessed instead was annihilation. From the moment the A-10 Warthogs entered the scenario, the battlefield changed. Low-flying, silent, deadly. Within 20 minutes, over 100 simulated Soviet tanks were declared destroyed. Not by air superiority fighters, not by nuclear strikes, but by a slow, ugly aircraft with straight wings and a gun that sounded like ripping thunder. "It's a tractor," one Soviet liaison officer joked, "a flying tractor with wings." But then the battlefield umpires, US and NATO personnel running the scoring, showed the math. Every tank kill was precise. Every sortie survived. Even under heavy simulated air defenses, the A-10s made multiple passes, hitting soft targets, armor columns, and mobile artillery, with full loiter time, with impunity. And it wasn't just in this one war game. Over the course of a single year, in multiple NATO simulations across West Germany, A-10 squadrons repeatedly shattered entire Soviet-style armored brigades in under 30 minutes. No stealth, no speed, just a titanium bathtub, a nose-mounted cannon, and pilots who knew exactly where to shoot to. Soviet analysts dismissed it as Western exaggeration. They said it only worked because of scripted scenarios. They said real Soviet pilots and real SAM teams would never allow such success. But those same observers saw the strike patterns, saw the target photos, heard the gun. And quietly, a few of them began to worry. Because the Warthog didn't fight like a jet. It fought like artillery with wings, and it never seemed to leave until the job was done. The A-10 was never supposed to be a threat. It was mocked as too slow, too outdated, too vulnerable. But in war after war game, it did the one thing Soviet planners feared most. It erased armor, faster than the tanks could advance. And when that many tanks burn, doctrines collapse with them. Inside a gray, fluorescent-lit operations center near Kaliningrad, Soviet air doctrine analysts pored over the latest NATO assessments. Thick binders filled with diagrams of American aircraft, weapon systems, and mock deployment strategies lined the desks. At the center of it all was the file they took least seriously: the A-10 Thunderbolt II. To Soviet engineers, the A-10 was a technological embarrassment. It was slow, barely capable of Mach 0.6. It flew low and straight, presenting a perfect target. Its massive GAU-8 cannon weighed nearly as much as a MiG-21 fighter. And its design? Brutish, agricultural. "A tractor with missiles," one general scoffed. From the Kremlin's highest military echelons, the judgment was clear. The A-10 would never survive a modern battlefield. Soviet doctrine worshipped speed, altitude, and quantity. Fighters were sleek and fast. Bombers flew high and delivered from range. Helicopters struck from concealed positions and retreated immediately. The idea of sending a slow-moving aircraft directly into the heart of an armored advance was, to them, suicidal. Their assumptions were reinforced by theoretical models. The A-10, they argued, could be neutralized with a single Strela, or ZSU, burst. Its low speed made it an easy kill for any MiG or SAM battery. Its thin wings, oversized engine nacelles, and non-afterburning jets made it a joke in modern aviation. But here's what they missed. The A-10 wasn't built to win a dogfight. It wasn't built to outrun a missile. It was built to survive. Layered around the pilot was a 200-pound titanium bathtub, shielding against 23mm and even 57mm cannon fire. Every critical system, hydraulics, controls, electrical, was redundant, rerouted, or protected. The engines were spaced to minimize simultaneous hits, the fuel tanks were self-sealing, and the wings, designed to remain intact even if half of one was shot off. In war game after war game, when Soviet analysts simulated a strike on the A-10, the damage data came back unnerving. A direct hit from a ZSU-23 wouldn't down it. A shoulder-fired missile might damage it, but the pilot would often return to base. Even heavy Tutpo-A didn't guarantee a kill unless the A-10 flew directly into the fire. And that was the other miscalculation. A-10 pilots didn't fly into the fire. They flew with it. They adjusted. They angled. They turned the battlefield into a 3D geometry problem they always solved first. Soviet commanders, convinced of their own air superiority, wrote off the A-10 as obsolete before it even deployed. They would soon learn. The Warthog didn't need to be fast. It just needed to be there. And when it was, tanks died. Quickly. The room of wrong assumptions was full of charts and confidence, but none of it would survive contact with the Avenger. To understand why the A-10 terrified Soviet war planners, eventually, you first have to understand what it shattered. Deep battle doctrine. This wasn't just a strategy, it was the Soviet vision of future war. Developed in the interwar years and refined across multiple Cold War fronts, deep battle emphasized rapid, overwhelming advances by armor and mechanized infantry. The theory was simple. Don't just penetrate NATO lines, flood them. Breach, exploit, overrun, repeat, and do it faster than NATO could respond. At the heart of this doctrine were massive armored columns, entire tank armies surging westward. Each Soviet division would be supported by mobile artillery, air defenses, engineers, and close air assets. Speed was paramount. Shock was the weapon. Attrition was acceptable. NATO's entire strategy for defending Western Europe was built to delay these waves long enough to regroup, or to use tactical nukes if necessary. But then came the A-10. It wasn't a nuke. It wasn't a high-altitude bomber. It was something far more dangerous to Soviet deep battle. A weapon designed to survive inside the wave and kill it from within. Soviet planners believed speed and saturation would overcome NATO defenses. What they hadn't accounted for was a platform that could loiter over the battlefield for hours, picking off tanks one by one, coordinating with forward observers, returning for re-attacks, and refueling and rearming within minutes. The A-10 didn't just slow down a Soviet advance, it punctured it. Every destroyed tank was more than a statistic. It was a node in the Soviet logistical chain, a bridge layer, a command vehicle, an artillery piece. The Warthog didn't just hunt armor, it dismantled momentum. NATO commanders began to build entire defensive scenarios around A-10 coverage. Warthog squadrons trained to strike key choke points. Bridge crossings, narrow forest roads, supply lines. If the Soviets pushed forward, they would meet mines, resistance, and then the A-10. And the more NATO refined the playbook, the clearer it became. Soviet armor could no longer count on speed alone, because no matter how fast they advanced, the A-10 was already there. Waiting. Watching. Loaded. And when it opened fire, it didn't just stall the doctrine, it broke it. The deep battle strategy depended on coordinated high-speed thrusts. But in simulated engagements and later real-world operations, a single A-10 squadron could disable an entire Soviet brigade's momentum in under 30 minutes. That wasn't attrition. That was collapse. The Soviet playbook had no answer, because it never imagined the Warthog would be real, let alone this effective. September 1982, West Germany. The NATO exercise was called Carbine Fortress. Its goal? Simulate a Soviet armored push through the Fulda Gap. Hundreds of NATO and US personnel played the roles of defenders, with Soviet-style Red Force aggressors deploying tanks and mobile air defenses at scale. Most observers expected the exercise to follow familiar patterns. Delaying actions, artillery barrages, stalemates. Then the A-10s arrived. Flying in low over tree lines and hills, 8 Warthogs took the field, each loaded with AGM-65 Mavericks, cluster bombs, and their infamous GAU-8 cannons. They were given one objective: disrupt the Red Force armor column before it could breach NATO's third defense line. What happened next stunned the entire war room. Within the first 5 minutes, the A-10s had destroyed 27 tanks. Another 19 were marked Mission Kill, disabled tracks or damaged optics. Mobile artillery pieces and command vehicles followed. The simulated Soviet advance was paralyzed. They couldn't move forward, couldn't reform, couldn't return effective fire. NATO umpires ended the scenario early. Why? Because the entire simulated Soviet brigade had been neutralized. Not by a combined arms response, not by carpet bombing, by 8 subsonic low-altitude aircraft. Soviet liaison officers in attendance were speechless. They'd seen A-10 schematics. They'd read the NATO brochures. They still hadn't believed. Until they watched the footage. One pass, one kill. Another pass. Another tank gone. Repeated. Relentless. What unnerved them most wasn't the damage. It was the survivability. The A-10s operated in contested airspace filled with simulated man-pads and ZSU fire. Yet not one was marked as shot down. Several returned damaged under exercise rules, hit by theoretical rounds, but none were ruled out of action. Why? Because the Warthog was designed to take hits and keep flying. Its pilots trained to fly in combat conditions no jet was supposed to endure. They used terrain. They coordinated with forward air controllers. They adjusted on the fly, and they hunted tanks like wolves tracking prey. After-action reports showed something even more startling. Each pilot expended less than 25% of their available ordnance. They could have gone back in again, and again, and again. It wasn't just one successful sortie. It was a sustained kill chain, and it worked flawlessly. Back at Soviet military academies, the exercise was quietly dismissed as unrealistic. Western propaganda, NATO stagecraft. But one analyst included a warning in his summary. If this aircraft can fly in our kill zones, then our tanks will die there. It was the first time the Soviets admitted, off the record, that the A-10 was something different. Not a curiosity, not a slow target, but a tactical revolution with wings. And no one had an answer. The reports reached the GRU's 16th Directorate by winter. Dozens of pages, photographs, diagrams, after-action summaries from NATO's Carbine Fortress exercise, all pointing to the same conclusion: the A-10 had wiped out a full armored push without a single loss. But in Moscow, that data hit a wall of disbelief. Senior Soviet officers dismissed the findings outright. One general called it fabricated theater. Another insisted it was simulated kill propaganda. A third claimed the U.S. was inflating A-10 effectiveness to justify military spending. It wasn't just skepticism. It was ideological rejection, because admitting the A-10 worked meant admitting the doctrine didn't, that their prized armored columns, the same ones that defined Soviet battlefield dominance, were vulnerable to a plane that looked like a 1940s design. So instead, they chose denial. Internal memos reassured battalion commanders. The A-10 is too slow to evade modern SAMs. Its low-altitude profile makes it an easy kill for Strela teams. Its cannon is ineffective against sloped frontal armor. On paper, it all seemed logical. But outside of Moscow, real-world evidence was piling up. In Afghanistan, Soviet BTRs and BMPs were being ravaged by Mujahideen ambushes with far weaker weapons. Reports from those conflicts began highlighting a disturbing trend. Armor was dying. Easily. Back in Europe, NATO exercises now centered their defensive plans around A-10 deployments. Air bases were restructured for faster rearming. Ground units trained in direct coordination with Warthogs. Artillery spotters received specialized training to mark armored targets for low-flying CAS platforms. The West wasn't just fielding the A-10. They were building doctrine around it. Still, Moscow refused to change course. Their bet was en masse. If 100 tanks could be destroyed, they'd send 1,000. If A-10s could kill 10 per sortie, they'd saturate with firepower and drown them out. It was war by brute force, an approach that worked in 1945. But in 1985, with laser-guided munitions, Jeep coming online, and battlefield integration exploding across NATO lines, that logic was already collapsing. And Soviet planners still had one hope: that the A-10 wouldn't survive real combat. That in a live-fire war, it would break down. That NATO wouldn't have the will to fly it into fire. They would soon be proven wrong. Because the A-10 wasn't just capable, it was relentless. And when Desert Storm came, Moscow's denial would end in fire. Soviet doctrine was clear. Any aircraft flying under 500 knots over a battlefield saturated with radar-guided missiles, mobile anti-aircraft guns, and interceptor coverage would not survive. End of debate. The A-10 flew at 300 knots. Its design screamed vulnerability. No afterburners, straight wings, no stealth, and no escape speed. Soviet generals clung to that fact like a shield. They'd invested billions into layered anti-air defenses, ZSU-23-4 Shilkas, SA-8 Gecko missiles, and the fearsome SA-6 Gainful system. These were mobile, trackable, and fielded in large numbers to escort armored columns into NATO territory. The theory: intercept low-flying attackers before they could line up a shot. Use radar guidance and overlapping kill zones to deny Western aircraft any entry point. And if all else failed, deploy MiG-21s and MiG-23s to hunt from above. On paper, it was airtight. In reality, it failed, because the theory missed one thing. The A-10 was built specifically to survive all of it. Unlike fast movers that had to avoid missile zones, the Warthog embraced them. Its cockpit, shielded by a titanium bathtub, could survive direct hits. Its redundant control systems gave pilots continued flight, even after losing hydraulics. Its engines were separated to prevent dual losses from a single strike. And most importantly, its tactics were not those of a traditional aircraft. A-10 pilots trained to fly below radar, using terrain as a shield. They weaved through valleys, hugged tree lines, banked behind hills. Enemy radars couldn't track them long enough to lock. And when the aircraft popped over a ridge, it was already in firing position. The Soviets had expected altitude. They got ambush. Even more humiliating, NATO had trained to exploit Soviet target saturation. A-10s flew in pairs, constantly rotating in and out. While one drew fire, the other struck. If a radar pinged them, the source was marked and destroyed in the next pass. Shilkas and SA-6s were terrifying, until A-10s learned where they were. And the Warthog always came back for round two. The Soviets also failed to anticipate the pilot mindset. US A-10 crews were trained in real-life, low-altitude combat runs, firing live rounds on tank husks, simulating SAM evasion, practicing bailout under fire. They weren't just familiar with danger, they thrived in it. Soviet MiG pilots, by contrast, were expected to engage from distance. Tank commanders were told air cover would arrive quickly. Neither realized that the A-10 was not a jet to chase. It was a problem to survive. The Soviet theory, that a slow, armored aircraft couldn't live in a modern air zone, made one fatal error. It forgot that sometimes survivability beats speed, especially when the plane is designed to kill tanks and survive the response. And the Warthog did both. Every time. If Soviet air defense planners misjudged the A-10's survivability, their tank designers made an even bigger mistake. They believed their armor could survive its firepower. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Soviet tank evolution centered around the T-64, T-72, and later the T-80. Each new generation promised stronger frontal protection, sloped armor, and eventually explosive reactive armor, ERA, designed to defeat shaped charges and high-velocity penetrators. The assumption? That their composite arrays and reactive tiles would either deflect, detonate, or dissipate most NATO munitions, especially those from man-portable systems or conventional aircraft cannons. But none of that mattered when the A-10's GAU-8A Avenger came into play. This wasn't a gun. It was a flying siege weapon. At 19 feet long and weighing 4,000 pounds, the GAU-8 could fire 3,900 depleted uranium rounds per minute, each round traveling at 3,500 feet per second, with armor-piercing capability that turned even the strongest Soviet frontal plates into molten shrapnel. In live-fire tests conducted at U.S. ranges, A-10 pilots routinely scored kill shots on moving tank targets from altitudes as low as 50 feet. The cannon's accuracy was absurd, able to focus an entire burst within a 10-foot spread from over 4,000 feet out. Soviet planners assumed ERA would save them, but the A-10 didn't target ERA. It went around it. Pilots aimed for thinner top armor, engine decks, exposed tracks, and ammo compartments. And the Avenger didn't need a direct hit. It could saw through a T-72's turret ring, rupture its fuel tanks, or ignite munitions stored internally. Field tests showed that a single 1-second burst from the GAU-8 could disable or destroy a tank. In Operation Desert Storm, that's exactly what happened. Even upgraded T-72Ms, export versions with enhanced plating, were incinerated in seconds by A-10 strikes. Some crews bailed before the impact. Others never had the chance. "You don't hear the gun until after your tank is already dead," one Iraqi POW said. "It was like thunder, but from the inside." Soviet armor doctrine assumed a war of attrition. They expected some losses, but they believed the majority of tanks would survive first contact. The A-10 flipped that assumption. By 1991, battlefield analysts were reporting kill ratios of 50-1 in some engagements. Entire tank battalions lost in under 30 minutes. And the weapon that did it? A cannon Soviet scientists had dismissed as a gimmick. In truth, it was the single most effective anti-armor weapon of the late 20th century, and it was mounted to a plane they said would never work. The second wrong theory was this: that tanks could survive the A-10. History proved they couldn't. And the graveyards of T-72s still baking in the sun were all the proof anyone needed. The KGB and GRU had extensive files on the A-10 Warthog. They knew its name, its specs, its payload. They had satellite images of it deployed across Germany. They had estimates of its range, speed, and cannon velocity. But for all their information, they made one fatal miscalculation. They believed the A-10 was a standalone system, a slow aircraft with a big gun and no backup. That belief was not just incorrect. It was a total intelligence failure. In reality, the A-10 was only the final link in a kill chain that stretched across multiple NATO platforms. First came the Forward Air Controllers, FACs, embedded with frontline infantry or airborne in small reconnaissance aircraft. These men were trained to observe, track, and laser mark armored targets across complex terrain, passing targeting data in real time. Next came satellite imagery and battlefield surveillance aircraft, especially the E-8J Stars, which could monitor moving armor columns across hundreds of kilometers. Add to that the constant eye of AWACS, airborne command posts coordinating hundreds of sorties at once, and the A-10 never flew blind. By the time the Warthog reached the battle space, it already had a full target dossier: coordinates, altitudes, movement vectors, threat zones, and in some cases, laser designations glowing on Soviet hulls. Soviet planners assumed the A-10 would search for targets, but it never needed to. The targets were fed to it. This was a shock to Soviet intelligence officers who'd grown up on centralized control doctrine. In their view, aircraft were slaves to ground control intercept, GCI radars, and static command posts. American pilots, by contrast, were trained to operate autonomously, dynamically shifting objectives based on real-time data. They didn't ask permission. They asked for the next kill. Even more disturbing for the Soviets was how quickly the A-10 could return to battle. They assumed a high turnaround time, slow refueling, complex rearming. But at forward bases in West Germany and Saudi Arabia, A-10 crews reloaded and refueled in under 20 minutes. They could strike, land, reload, strike again. 3 or 4 sorties per pilot, per day. And then there was the ordnance. Soviet analysts focused too heavily on the GAU-8 and overlooked the Maverick missiles, cluster bombs, and guided rockets the A-10 carried. Precision strike capabilities were increasing year by year. By 1991, A-10s were reliably engaging multiple moving targets per run and leaving no survivors. Worse still, the Soviets had no way to replicate it. Their Su-25 Frogfoot was the closest analog, but lacked loiter time, was vulnerable to light AA, and had inferior pilot protection. Their intelligence divisions were stuck in the past, measuring capability by platform, not by system. They thought the A-10 was the threat, but the real threat was how the US made it fight. By the time they realized that, the battlefield was already on fire. The A-10 Warthog didn't dominate the battlefield just because it was rugged, or slow, or carried a monstrous cannon. It dominated because it was the product of something far more lethal, the most integrated battlefield system ever fielded during the Cold War. At its core, the A-10 was designed to operate within a doctrine called air-land battle, a revolutionary shift in how the US envisioned modern warfare. Instead of separate branches operating in silos, air-land battle fused land and air units into a single, synchronized machine. And the A-10 was its scalpel. Where Soviet forces relied on centralized command and rigid pre-planned strikes, NATO, especially the US, was perfecting something terrifyingly fluid. Step 1. Information dominance. AWACS aircraft flew continuous orbits over friendly and contested airspace, detecting every airborne and large ground threat. J-STARS monitored enemy formations from hundreds of kilometers away, tracking convoys, armored columns, and artillery emplacements in real time. Step 2. Target relay. Every A-10 pilot received live data feeds from ground controllers, AWACS, and even satellites. As a result, Warthog pilots often entered battlespace with more intelligence than Soviet tank commanders had on their own surroundings. Step 3. Direct pilot empowerment. Unlike Soviet doctrine, which treated pilots as extensions of command centers, A-10 pilots were trained to adapt mid-mission. They had authority to reroute, prioritize targets, re-engage, and even request support without seeking layered approvals. This wasn't chaos. It was agile warfare. Then came logistics. The A-10 was cheap to fly. It could operate from damaged runways, makeshift airstrips, and even highways. Ground crews turned them around in under 30 minutes using minimal tools and maximum efficiency. In field conditions where a Soviet MiG might sit grounded for hours, the Warthog went back to war, again and again. And while Soviet aircraft were often tied to specific armaments or limited by base infrastructure, the A-10 carried everything from laser-guided Mavericks to cluster bombs to airburst rounds. It was a flying armory, and every weapon it dropped was tracked and evaluated to refine future targeting. Behind every Warthog strike was a command infrastructure linking generals, battalion commanders, artillery spotters, satellite officers, and intel teams. If one tank popped up on radar, it wasn't just seen. It was targeted, assessed, and queued for kill within minutes. And because the A-10's loiter time could exceed 2 hours, it acted as persistent overwatch, waiting for armor to appear, then striking with precision that left Soviet commanders stunned. In training, American pilots had destroyed tanks lined up on ranges, but in combat, they destroyed entire armored formations in motion. They weren't just flying. They were executing networked destruction, where every asset supported the others in real time. Soviet tank crews never had that luxury. Once separated from their command structure, they were vulnerable, alone, tracked, hunted. And the A-10 knew exactly where to look. In the Cold War arms race, the Soviets built platforms, but the US built systems. And when systems fight platforms, the platforms die. Every time. January 1991. The Persian Gulf. Operation Desert Storm begins. It's the first true test of the A-10 Warthog in a full-scale, high-intensity armored conflict. And it is about to obliterate everything the Soviets thought they knew about air-ground warfare. In the deserts of Iraq and Kuwait, Soviet-supplied T-72s and BMPs rolled across wide-open terrain, exactly the environment Soviet doctrine predicted would favor armored assaults. But in practice, it was a killing field. On day one of the ground campaign, A-10 squadrons launched one after wave of sorties. Low altitude, heavy payloads, every pilot armed with Mavericks cluster munitions and the ever-ready GAU-8 Avenger cannon. What followed was an aerial massacre. In less than 72 hours, Warthogs executed over 500 combat missions, often flying 4 to 6 sorties per day. And the results were devastating. 900 Iraqi tanks destroyed. 1,200 APCs eliminated. Hundreds of artillery pieces, convoys, and hardened positions wiped out. Entire Iraqi divisions, trained in Soviet tactics and outfitted with Soviet armor, were reduced to twisted metal under relentless A-10 fire. U.S. intelligence reported kill ratios so lopsided that commanders were asked to double-check the numbers. In one sector alone, A-10s disabled or destroyed 50 armored vehicles in a single afternoon, without a single aircraft lost. And that's when the Soviets started watching. From secure facilities in Moscow, senior officers monitored the war through satellite images and leaked reports. They saw the wreckage, they read the strike data, and they realized those were their tanks. The same T-72s they'd touted as the backbone of armored supremacy. The same ZSU-23s and SA-6s they claimed would make NATO aircraft unviable. None of it worked. In fact, some Iraqi crews abandoned their vehicles at the sound of A-10 engines. They'd seen what happened when the Warthog opened fire. They didn't want to die inside a metal coffin. "The cannon sounded like God's hammer," said one Iraqi defector. "By the time you saw it, it had already fired." A-10s took damage, yes. Some limped back with holes in their wings, engine fires, and shredded control surfaces, but almost all made it home. And the pilots? They turned around, rearmed, and went back in. The Soviets had laughed at the Warthog for its lack of speed. Now they saw it didn't need speed. It needed presence. And it never left the battlefield until the armor was dead. Every rule Moscow had written, about how tanks would dominate future wars, about how low-flying aircraft would never survive, about how the A-10 was a relic, burned in the sand alongside their exported machinery. This wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was a strategic humiliation. Because the most underestimated aircraft in the American arsenal had just shattered the credibility of the Red Army's most sacred weapon. And it wasn't stealthy. It wasn't fast. It was right. Every time it fired, a myth died. The Gulf War didn't just reveal a tactical mismatch. It exposed a fundamental ideological failure, one that shook Soviet military theory to its foundations. For decades, The USSR had structured its force projection around armored dominance. Tanks weren't just a military tool. They were a symbol of Soviet strength, mechanized discipline, and industrial might. And yet, in a matter of days, that myth crumbled. Not under a nuclear barrage, not beneath overwhelming numbers, but at the hands of subsonic aircraft with a single gun. The A-10 had made a mockery of Soviet assumptions. Its slow speed didn't matter. Its lack of stealth didn't matter. Its battlefield performance was so consistent, so brutal, that it rendered Soviet tank formations functionally obsolete. The psychological damage ran deep. Inside Soviet war colleges, doctrine committees quietly began revising their estimates of NATO air support effectiveness. They increased the expected A-10 kill ratio per sortie. They restructured mock exercises to account for total air dominance. And in classified circles, they began asking dangerous questions. Was the Soviet battlefield even survivable in a real NATO war? Could their tanks reach objectives before being erased? Was massed armor still viable in the face of platforms like the Warthog? By 1991, these weren't fringe theories. They were the new reality. And for a military system built on unwavering belief in its own superiority, this was intolerable. Just as devastating was the realization that Soviet airframes had no equivalent. The Su-25 Frogfoot, their closest analog to the A-10, lacked loiter time, targeting integration, and survivability. It was faster, but it couldn't stay in the fight. It couldn't deliver the kill chains NATO had perfected. Worse, the US was already upgrading. Joint operations with AWACS, J-STARS, and laser-designated weaponry meant future Warthog strikes would be even more precise, requiring fewer rounds, less time, and producing more reliable kills. And it wasn't just about tech. It was the mindset. The way US pilots trained for the exact terrain, the exact enemy, the exact conditions they would fight in. The Soviets, constrained by rigid doctrine and limited pilot initiative, couldn't match it. Not in training, not in mindset, not in execution. And in the end, even the Soviet commanders had to admit the truth. They'd prepared for the wrong war. They built tanks for mass attack. But NATO had built planes to hunt them. And those planes worked. Flawlessly. By the time the Red Army withdrew from Eastern Europe, the writing was on the wall. The Warthog hadn't just erased tanks. It had erased the future of Soviet strategy. And nothing, not pride, not propaganda, not denial, could hide the burn marks it left behind. Today, the A-10 Warthog still flies. Against all odds. Against every Pentagon proposal to retire it. Against every new stealth fighter or drone that promised to replace it. Why? Because nothing else flies into fire quite like it. Nothing else was built to take damage and return with kills. Its pilots call it a friend. Its enemies call it a nightmare. Its allies call when they're in trouble. The Cold War is over, but the battlefield ghosts remain. Across the deserts of Iraq, rusting T-72s still sit scorched, silent witnesses to the day the Warthog came screaming through the sky. Across training ranges in Germany, old BMP hulls lie shredded, pocked with 30mm holes, testaments to a doctrine that never saw the future coming. And inside museums in Moscow, the silence around the A-10's success is deafening. Because the A-10 didn't just win battles, It discredited an entire philosophy. It proved that survivability beats speed, that precision crushes numbers, that the pilot matters more than the machine's silhouette. In the decades since, the U.S. has built fifth-gen stealth fighters and precision drones. But when armored columns emerge in satellite photos, when infantry calls for help, when the skies are ugly and the targets too close for comfort, the Warthog still launches. Low, slow, armed. The Soviets mocked it, then feared it, then lost to it. And now, every time an A-10 takes off, it carries not just a pilot and a cannon, but a legacy. The Cold War never went hot in Europe. But if it had, the Warthog would have painted the Fulda Gap with flame. Because some machines don't just defy expectations, they rewrite history.